Hello and welcome to the Educatedcollins Snap channel. How you doing? So today we're going to be talking about Ka-Zar. Yes, that deck, that KaZOO deck that you probably played early on in Pool 1. We're going to be trying to cover it, trying to explain how it works. Maybe you're still playing it. There are still some people that play it as their main deck. And we're going to try to break that down, how it works, how to utilize it, and why it's so prevalent. Let's begin. So, I guess the first thing we want to talk about when we look at this deck is we have Ka-Zar Blue Marvel. KaZOO is from Hearthstone, I would say. It used to be, well, maybe it's from Magic, but it's from a card game where KaZOO is you rush cards down with tons of small minions, like a zoo. Essentially, that's where it comes from. But the deck strategy is you play tons of cheap one-cost cards to flood the board while you buff them with Ka-Zar and Blue Marvel. So that's the main engine. You need Ka-Zar, you need Blue Marvel. Those are your main buffers, but you also need a ton of cheap cards to play. That's where the one-cost cards come in. So here we have a standard list. This list is pretty standard, I would say. Nothing too special. You're running a couple of flex cards with the Mr. Fantastic, the Iron Man, the Sentinel. But other than that, Ka-Zar decks aren't super unique. You're usually running Angelica Bishop as your other like core cards, and then Ka-Zar Blue Marvel for your standard buff strategies. There's ways to work around these limitations, but that's usually how most decks look like. So, core card Ka-Zar, this is the namesake. It buffs all your one-cost cards, making them a little bit more threatening, right? You get 1 power for all the one-cost cards you're playing, so you're just incentivized to play as many ones as you can. That makes sense in your deck. So, it's a core card. If you don't have this card in your deck, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to run all the small one drops because you're not really gaining that much value from playing them. Next up, we have Blue Marvel. This is another core piece. So just like Ka-Zar, this one buffs your cards, except it buffs everything. It's not just limited to the one cost. So usually on 4, you're playing Ka-Zar. On 5, you're playing Blue Marvel. That's usually how you want it to go. So it's just a core piece. You need it. I would say it's kind of a weird KaZOO deck to play without Blue Marvel. I don't really think that would make a lot of sense. So yeah, those 2 cards are really core. Next up, we have Angela. So this ends up being core because it's one of the best 2 drops you can play for this type of deck. You can get a ton of power all the minions being played. So with Angela, you play this on an empty lane, and then you'll play 3 other cards on top of it, and that'll give your Angela 6 power. So 2 mana, 6 power is really good. The nice thing though is we usually run Nightcrawler in these KaZOO builds, so Nightcrawler can move itself after you play it. So if you play the Nightcrawler on the Angela lane, well then the turn after you can move it, potentially giving Angela a power of 8. So you'll get the 6 plus you'll get the extra 2 from moving the Nightcrawler over. So that combined with Blue Marvel, this can alone give you 9 power. So 2 mana, 9 power potential is really, really good. So definitely a strong card. Definitely a card you want to be playing. Bishop has kind of the same feeling. It's a little bit worse than the Angela in my opinion, even though it costs more. So you play Bishop on 3, and then 4, 5, 6. Usually turn 6, you're flooding the board with tons of low-cost 1 drops. So that's where you really get these huge turn buffs from Bishop. So on turn 4, you're usually playing 1 card. Turn 5, you're usually playing 1 card. But turn 6, you can be playing upwards of like 4 or 5 cards. So the Bishop can end up being a 3-7, a 3-8, a 3-9 if you're lucky, that kind of thing. So it's very similar to Angela in how much buffs you can, but since it costs more, I would say it's a little bit worse, but it's still a really good card and definitely can get very strong by playing your cheap 1 costs. So the core of the deck, you have the minion buffer. So these cards buff your minions and cause your cheap minions to become threatening. So the interesting thing is there's only 2 of them. There's only Ka-Zar, Blue Marvel. Those are your namesakes. And there's not a lot of extra minion buffers. And there's not that many minion buffing cards in the game, I would say. In the sense of what Ka-Zar and Blue Marvel do, there's not that many cards that have that same effect, especially as an ongoing. There are some on-reveal buffers, but not really ongoing buffers the way that these 2 cards do. So these are your core cards. These are cards you really need to draw in a game to feel good. Then you have your cheap minions. So these minions cost 1 energy. They can be utilized in the late game to drop down tons of power. So usually if you're a new player, we're going to talk about this, but usually as a new player, you're just spamming your 1-drops early. That's not really how you want to maneuver this deck list. The real power of this deck list is your ability to calculate the points that you can put on every lane. So what this allows you to do, once you understand what your opponent's trying to play, you could say, okay, they're going to have 20 power in this lane. I can manipulate my small power advantages to get 21 here in this lane. Then I'll beat them by 1. And that's really why Ka-Zar shines. You have so many numbers to work with that you can kind of manipulate the board states to get exactly where you want the power to be. And if you want to beat them by 1 power, by 2 power, that's very easy to do. With other decks, you don't really have that freedom or that flexibility to be like, okay, they're going to have 20 power here, 14 power here, 10 power here. Let's win by 21-0 or is 21-2 and then 13 or something like that. It's hard to do that with other decks. Or with this deck, you can really take advantage of all the small minions to really place every bit of power exactly where you want it. And that's the real power of this deck. So here are the list of the small minions that we have in this deck. This isn't all the small minions that you could play. There's a ton of small minions in the game that you can work with. But these are like very early game centric minions that you're going to have pretty early in the game. So most people can work with this. But as you climb, as you have more tools, you can definitely swap some of these out for more for ones that you prefer. Basically, you don't have to be playing this the whole time. So how do you pilot this deck? First, you want to set up your Angelicas and Bishops first if you can, right? So Angela first, Bishop afterwards. Then you want to be playing the cheap minions afterwards, right? So every minion you play on the Angela lane is giving Angela +2. So you definitely want to have things to play after you play Angela. And every card you're playing after Bishop is +1. So you want to be playing cards after the Bishop. So preferably, if you can, you want to play Angela and then Bishop. You can play something on 1, but you don't have to. So playing a 1-drop on 1 isn't usually bad if you're going to have extra energy left over. But in a lot of games, you'll be left with energy you can use on the last turn, right? So we don't have a 6-drop. In this version of the list, there are lists with 6-drop versions that we're going to talk about in the build examples. But in this current version, you don't have anything to play on 6. So a lot of times, you're going to be playing Ka-Zar on 4, Blue Marvel on 5, and then you're going to have a ton of 1-drops in your hand still. And you're going to be able to play like 2-drop, 4 1-drops, or 5 1-drops, or something of that nature. So if you get that feeling that you're going to have all that extra energy to play a ton of 1-drops, so you don't have to spam your 1-drops early. You could definitely save your 1-drops for significantly later in the game. So that's something you have to keep in mind of. Same thing where like if you don't get the Ka-Zar on 4, right, then maybe you want to play your 1s on 4 so that if you do get Ka-Zar on 6, you can play Ka-Zar 2 1-drops. But then it means keep 2 1-drops for that top deck. If you're like, oh, highest thing I could draw is the Ka-Zar that I want to play. Let me play my 1s and then have the freedom to maneuver the points around for the last turn on 6, that kind of thing. So early on the collection tracks, this is below 222, which is where Pool 2 starts. The only card you need to worry about is Electra. So you don't really have Killmonger before then. And even after 222, most people are not gonna get their first pool 2 card Killmonger. That's not gonna happen. So even past that, you don't really have to worry about Killmonger. But eventually, you will have to worry about Killmonger. Eventually, people will all have Killmonger, and if they're playing against a ton of Ka-Zar, then you're going to have to react to that. So later on, Killmonger becomes available to players, and you have to prepare for that. Usually, how you prepare for that is running armor and also not having priority on turn 6, so that even if they want to Killmonger you on 6, they have the priority, so they're going to go first, and then you're going to flood the board with the 1-drops on turn 6. So you kind of have to adjust your playstyle. You have to adjust your deck once you realize people have Killmongers and they're putting it into their deck. So usually you add an armor, and then you add these you change your playstyle so that even if they Killmonger you on the last turn, you haven't committed that many of your 1-drops, and you can flood the board on 6. So you do have to be careful how you play afterwards. Gaining priority on the final turn can be a big weakness, so you do have to be careful, like making sure they aren't beating you. It can be easy to do because you're not playing that much early. You're playing like a 0-cost Angela, you're playing a 1-cost or maybe like 3-cost Bishop, you're playing a 4-cost 4-drop, you're playing a 5-cost Blue Marvel, or I mean 3 power. It's usually like 6 7 power if you add it all, but still 5 mana 7 power Blue Marvel. These are not a lot of power, so it can be very easy to not have priority in the final turn, and then you'll play like 30 plus power on that last turn, that kind of thing. So you just have to be aware of that and make sure that you're playing to your outs, especially once you have Killmonger, because that ends up being like one of their only real win conditions. There are other ways to beat this deck, but Killmonger is the most common one, so you'd have to be always playing around that. So in optimal scenarios, you'd be playing Angela into Bishop, into Ka-Zar, into Blue Marvel. Yep, that's exactly right. Into spamming all of your 1-cost cards on the final turn. So usually you'll have like 4 or 5 1-drops, and then you can just play all those 1-drops plus something else. Sometimes you're going to have like Iron Man, so you'll play Iron Man plus a 1-drop. If that's going on, then you maybe have to change it. And you have to make sure that the Iron Man is worth it, right? So a lot of cases you're like, no, I'd rather just play all these flexible 1-drops. So optimal scenario, you're playing Angela, Bishop, Ka-Zar, Blue Marvel, and then you're spamming your 1-drops. And that's usually how this deck wants to play. So here we have some powerful plays. So the first one's Angela into Bishop. So that's basically 3 power. If you it could be 1 power if you play them on different lanes, but if you play Angela Bishop on the same lane, that's 3 power. And that looks kind of bad. But then every time you play a card into that lane, you're getting +3 on top of the card you're playing. So it can end up being like insane amounts of value. So this is your core setup. If you want to have a really powerful lane, you could play Angela Bishop into the same lane, and you're like, ooh, that lane is going to be hard to lose because you're getting so much scaling on that particular lane. So it's actually a pretty powerful play. Then we have Ka-Zar plus Blue Marvel plus Squirrel Girl. So you're just playing 1-1-drop. Right? That will end up being 17 power. That Squirrel Girl represents 9 power over the 3 lanes, because each of the Squirrel Girl plus the squirrels will be 3 power each. So it's a 1 mana 9 power, which is like insane. But like Squirrel Girl is one of your best 1-drops to play. So, you know, I'm just showing some of the powerful plays. But yeah, you can really do a lot of work with this. And then the last one, this one, I'm assuming you have Ka-Zar, you have Blue Marvel on the board, and then on turn 6, you play Angela, Elektra, Cog, Squirrel Girl, Ant-Man, right? Like that. Angela's what, 7 power, Elektra's 3, Cog is 4, but Elektra you're killing a card, so it's even better than 3. Squirrel Girl is 9, Ant-Man is 6. So you're getting 29 power on that final turn, plus, you know, whatever the Elektra's killing. So you can really do those. That's the power of this deck. You get these huge swings on the final turn if you're playing it that style, and it can be a really nice surprise for people. Like usually, especially experienced players, they'll know what you're doing, so they'll be aware of it, but it's hard to calculate exactly what points you're putting where and how much power everything's going to be. But yeah, you have a lot of room to maneuver, and that's really why people like this deck, why this deck gets played a lot, because there's so much flexibility in how much points you're putting on each of the locations, and that can be really, really nice. So, some powerful plays to look out for. Next up, we have some of the flex spots in this deck. So we have Sentinel, Mr. Fantastic, Iron Man. So these aren't really necessary cards for this deck, but they're nice flex cards. Mr. Fantastic is just a really good 3. It fights every lane, and it just kind of does a little bit, but does it consistently. So usually I really like Mr. Fantastic. It's my favorite ongoing 3. Definitely like putting it in when I can. Sentinel is just a filler card for 2. If you don't have your Angela, you can always just play Sentinels. And if you don't want to play your 1-drops because you're scared of Killmonger at some point, then Sentinels will kind of fill in the gap. So definitely something you can play. And then Iron Man is just another late game tool. Since we're not running a 6-drop, sometimes you want to win a lane. You really want to win that lane, like maybe it's Nexus or something. Iron Man can be that tool to say, okay, I just need to win this lane. Iron Man, please do it for me. So Iron Man is definitely something you can use. And then I do have a 1-drop example, but pretty much all the 1-cost cards are flexible. So you don't have to run a Nightcrawler. You don't have to run a Cog or an Electra. So you just kind of need to have 1-drops that you're happy with. And if you do, then A-okay. So they're all flexible, but I didn't want to put every single 1-drop in there. But basically, every single 1-drop is flexible. All right, and then here we have some of the flex spot options. So the one I have asterisks on the armor because you probably want to be playing armor at some point. Maybe not early on in this deck list, but once the meta is Killmonger or you see a lot of Killmongers in your games, you want to run armor so that you don't have to worry about always having priority on the last turn or not playing something on 1, right? Sometimes you just want to play something on 1. You can play that card into armor and you know, okay, they can't Killmonger your 1-drop that you played early. So it just gives you more freedom to play more of your 1-drops early. So it's generally a good card to have. Then here we have a couple of the 1-drops that you could play. Sunspot, Iceman, Rocket Raccoon, Blade, Agent 13, Iron Fist. There's so many 1-drops. Uta, right? There's so many 1-drops that you can play, and they all kind of work. They all kind of do the same thing. So it's kind of personal preference which ones you like. I personally like Iceman. I think Iceman's pretty good. Rocket Raccoon I do like, but it's harder to play. But I like the card. Sunspot, a lot of people think it's one of the best cards in the game, so definitely makes sense. Then you have Okoye. So this card's a 2-mana 2/2, but it buffs your other cards. So since you tend to play all your cards, you'll usually get a good amount of buffs from it that get translated into the game state. So ends up being a pretty okay card in this archetype. Iron Fists, once again, is a 1-drop you can play. And then Mystique. Mystique is something I was thinking about, but yeah, you could easily play Mystique in this because you're playing Ka-Zar, you're playing Blue Marvel. You could easily turn 6, play the Mystique, copy the Blue Marvel, and then play 3 1-drops. So that's definitely something you can do. Usually what happens is once you are in pool 3 and you can play Mystique, people play Mystique with other decks. So they're not really thinking about putting Mystique in a Ka-Zar deck, but you can definitely do that if you want to. So it's an option. Then here we have some of the heavier options. Cosmo Rogue, these are 3-cost cards that you can easily play. Same thing with Wolfsbane. That's another 3-cost card. You can play Maximus as well as in the next list, but it goes here. It's another 3-cost card you can play. If you want to do that instead of Bishop, if you want to play something else, then you can definitely do that. Enchantress, Shang-Chi, these are very common tech cards that you can get in pool 2. So if you're seeing a ton of big cards or ongoing units, then you can just remove them with Shang-Chi or Enchantress. Then Captain America just makes your draws a little bit more consistent. And you also have something to play on turn 6 every single time. Instead of drawing a 1-drop on turn 6, you can just flood earlier and then end on a Captain America. So that's something you can do. Onslaught is something I've talked about in other Pool 1, Pool 2 deck lists where you can play, you're playing Ka-Zar ongoing, Blue Marvel ongoing. Well, then you can just follow that up with an Onslaught ongoing, kind of similar to Mystique, and just get all that value doubled. So that could be a nice finisher there. Then Strong Guy, you tend to play a ton of your cards. You tend to have empty hands. So Strong Guy just kind of works well as a 4-mana 10 power, which is really nice. So that's something you can do. Wolfsbane, we've talked about, right? You tend to have a full board, so Wolfsbane works. And then Chavez just gives you that draw consistency if you want to play it like that. Next up, we have Zero, Titania, Ebony Maw. These are more Pool 3 options, I guess, in terms of you're not going to really get this on Pool 2. But you can go Zero, Ebony Maw. That's a really powerful start. You can go Zero, Titania. That's a really powerful start. Same thing. A lot of these are just Series 3 cards. Scorpion, though, is not. Scorpion Series 2. So that's another option if you want to play a 2-drop on 2 instead of maybe Angela. You can play Scorpion. Scorpion definitely is a very annoying card. It's definitely really strong, so you could definitely play that. Goose is a way of limiting your opponent's answers to your board state. They can't play anything big. You can't play anything big, but you're not playing that many big cards, so it doesn't really bother you as much. But yeah, definitely can play Goose. M'Baku is something you can do if you want to. I'm not going to tell you it's good, but if you usually with M'Baku, 25% of the games you're going to not draw it. So 25% of the games you're going to have that extra card on your board. And then the 75% of the games you do draw M'Baku, it's just a regular 1-drop. So it's not, the downside isn't as bad because you're already playing all these 1-cost 1/2s anyways. But then 25% of the games you're going to have this big upside. So definitely something you can do. Maximus is nice. We did talk about it earlier, but it's a 3-mana 7, really good. With the Blue Marvel 3-mana 8, really, really nice power. Ultron's a nice finisher if you don't want to play a ton of 1-drops. On the 6th turn, you can basically play Ultron, which is kind of the same thing as flooding your board with 1-drops. Since you have Blue Marvel, since you have Ka-Zar, you're going to be summoning 3 power cards, which is really nice. So that's another way of having an answer or a big play on the last turn if you don't want to do the work of playing all these 1-drops. Patriot, of course, if you have Blue Marvel, Ka-Zar, Ultron, well, hello there. You know, basically a Patriot deck. So if you want to do that, you can definitely play Patriot. You do have to change up the deck a little bit, right? Maybe add Misty Knight that way and have some other win cons. But you could definitely transition this into a Patriot list very easily. So it does work. And then Valkyrie and Basque, right? These are ways to kind of have an early game start that's not really focused on the flooding, right? Basque can give all your 1-cost cards an extra boost of powers to make them even better than they already are, and they're pretty good anyways at the beginning. And then Valkyrie can give you another answer. Since you're flooding the board, it's going to be very easy to have 4 cards in the lane you Valkyrie, and then also gives you another way of dealing with your opponent's big answers. So that's definitely one tech you can do if you don't want to go Shang-Chi. You can definitely go Valkyrie as well. And then Bass is just a nice card there. Now, let's talk about some of the core card alternative options. So the nice thing about this deck is why it's played a lot is that all the core cards are Pool 1 or even earlier to get, right? So Angela, Bishop, those are the 2 that you're really going to struggle to get, but they're all Pool 1, so you get them before Collection 222. Pretty much everybody watching this, I'd be shocked if they don't have those cards already. So you can pretty much make this deck immediately. It's not a hard deck to make. And then if you don't have Angela, Bishop, you can just run more 1-drops if you're missing those cards, but you're going to get them pretty soon anyway, so it's not it's not a big downside. A lot of the times, it just means that you're gonna have to play this deck slightly unoptimized for like a day, and then you or 2 days, a couple of days, or whatever, and then you'll have Angel Bishop. So this is not a deck that struggles with alternative options for core cards, so it's not really a big deal usually there. So that's what we have to say about that. Now, when should you snap? So you should snap if you do not have priority on the final turn. Now that doesn't mean okay, I don't have priority, I snap. Obviously, look at your board state, look at your opponent's board state. See if they have like an infinite on the board or something, and then like okay, maybe we're not snapping. But if they don't have priority, then their killmongers won't do as much work usually, right? Usually you'll be saving your 1 cost cards for the last turn or close or something very close. So if they don't have priority, then even if they killmonger you, they're not going to hit the cards you're playing that turn, and that can be really big. So definitely a reason to snap if you don't have priority. And usually you want to be snapping before the final turn, so you have to kind of know that you're not going to have priority before the final turn, that kind of thing. So you can't just be like, oh, it's turn 6, I don't have priority, let me snap. Like that's too late. You have to be like, oh, it's turn 4, turn 5. The flow of the game feels like I'm not gonna have priority on the 6th turn. Let me snap. That's kind of what I'm talking about. You can't snap turn 6 a lot of the time. It's too telegraphed, and they will know if they're gonna lose or not. You're risking. It's too much risk, so they're probably gonna leave, or they're gonna be aware of what you're doing and then have a counterplay. So yeah, that's something to be aware of. And then also, if you have Ka-Zar, Blue Marvel, and then lots of 1 cost, Ka-Zar, Blue Marvel is your main engine. So if you have both of them in your on the field, and then you have a lot of 1 cost cards coming up, that's the reason to snap. So usually you want to be snapping once you have it in your hand. You like if you play the cards and then snap, like you're kind of telegraphing everything. But if you have those cards in your hand, if it's like turn 3, you have Ka-Zar in your hand, you have Blue Marvel in your hand, you have your good 1-drop Squirgle and whatever. Okay, and the board state looks reasonably good. You know their deck, and you know how much power they can reasonably put out. Okay, there's a time to snap. That's the kind of thing we're thinking about when we're deciding to snap or not. So keep that in mind when you're playing your games. Now, what are the weaknesses of this deck? Killmonger. It's Killmonger. This is the one big thing that's going to annoy you while you're playing the deck. You could instantly lose to this one card, and it's the biggest weakness. This is why this card doesn't always get played, because Killmonger is a pretty popular card in the meta, and if you're not expecting Killmonger and you're playing risky, it will completely blow you out of the water. So that's usually what's keeping this deck in check, and it just kind of works really well. So yeah, Killmonger is the weakness. Enchantress also can be the weakness. Enchantress Rogue, your main I guess win conditions in your ramp is both ongoings with the Ka-Zar and the Blue Marvel. Your 1-drops, like it doesn't matter that you're playing 1-drops if you can't buff them. So if they Enchantress your Ka-Zar, your Blue Marvel, that can be pretty bad. You can mitigate this a little bit by spreading out the buffs. You don't want to put them on the same lane. So this isn't as much of a weakness, but it still messes with you a lot. And a lot of times people play Enchantress on turn 4. So you're not seeing this on the final turn. You might see it on the final turn if it messes with you really badly or something, but a lot of times they're playing Enchantress on 4, and you're also playing the Ka-Zar on 4, so a lot of times it's not hitting the same lane, and it's just not as good. So Enchantress doesn't really hurt you as much, but it can lose you games for sure. So I did want to put it out there. And then board space locations, and the general board states. So there are locations that really mess you up, like Space Throne, like any location that prevents you from playing there, Plunder Castle, these kind of things. Throne Room, right? There's a lot of them where your board space is limited or your board state doesn't matter, and that can really mess you up. So you have to be careful in those locations that can really just give your opponent a free win in that one. So you do have to be careful there. But as long as you're making sense, you're not snapping into those locations. It's not a big deal as much as Killmonger, where you can pretty much lose every game if you're not respecting that card. So those are some of the weaknesses to think about. Now here we have some example builds. The first one here talks about armor. So this is just kind of a very samey build, but we've kind of broken it down to its essence. So we just have Angela, Bishop, Ka-Zar, Blue Marvel, and then armor. So this is like a very like pool 3, I guess, ready deck where you're just like, yeah, here's the bare essentials, and then armor, and then 1-drops, and it works. So definitely a composition you can try or copy if you want to use it. It definitely does work if you have it. Next up here we have the onslaught. So we're taking advantage of the onslaught synergy. So Ka-Zar, Blue Marvel, they're both ongoing, so onslaught would double the effects of that, and then you just have a couple of the 1-drops, and then you're still running Angela. We did take out the Bishop to kind of add more ongoing synergies. So here we have Mr. Fantastic, here we have Captain America, so that's a little bit more ongoing that you can work with the onslaught if you want to do it that way. So that's definitely another way of running the deck. It definitely can work if you want to have a big powerful 6-drop at the end. Next up, we're running the same deck list, except now we're running Shang-Chi and Enchantress. So now we're adding a little bit more counterplay into this deck list. Instead of not having any ways to react to your opponent's playstyle, now you can Enchantress their board, you can Shang-Chi their board. So you add a little bit of counterplay into the Ka-Zar list. So this is something you can do if you want to have a little bit more reactionary tools than nothing, or Electra. Electra is like your only reactionary tool normally, but now you have a little bit more tools to work with. So here, now we're running an Ultron list. So here we go, right? A little bit more spice. You're at the Ultron. We also have an Ebony Maw, which just kind of isn't as bad since you can fill it up with the Ultron, right? So since you have the ability to still put points into that lane, either with Squirrel Girl or Ultron, it's not like, oh, I play this and I can't affect that lane anymore. It's like you play this, it's going to be 9 power with Ka-Zar, Blue Marvel, and then you're going to play the Ultron on top, and then boom, now you're adding 9 more power into that lane. Can be really powerful. So the Ebony Maw does not have that big of a downside as it normally does. And then we have Storm. Just Storm locks a lane that they can't play with, and then now your Ultron can still affect that lane. So Ultron just allows you to do all that nice stuff. Now, next up we have another onslaught list, except this time we're adding a Chavez on top. So Chavez just gives you that extra turn 6 consistency. It also means that your early game draws are going to be more consistent. So you're going to be drawing the Angela on 3, you're going to be drawing the Ka-Zar on 5, Blue Marvel on 6 more likely. And then you always have something to do on turn 6. Usually with this list, you're going to be playing your 1-drops as fast as you can, because you always know that you're going to have something to do on 6. So you can't really save your 1-drops for turn 6 most of the time. So you kind of just have to play them early, which can be a downside if you're in a heavy Killmonger meta. So I don't like super recommend a list like this if you are dealing with Killmongers a lot. But if you're not, then this can be a pretty powerful deck list to run. Just have that consistency on the early game and the late game. Now, final build here. This is, I believe, from Freddy Babes, but it is the essence the same. This is still just a Ka-Zar deck, but he does have the Maximus there for a big power point play. That means you do have to be in pool 3 to hit the Maximus, so that is the like downside of this composition. But overall, it still works well. He has the Iron Fist here. Iron Fist is kind of like a Nightcrawler in that you can move the whatever you put in the Angela lane, you can just move it out of the way and then have that Angela still represent 8 points of power. So definitely a nice list here. Has a lot of good tools and just kind of works well if you can pilot it correctly. This is kind of a hard deck to pilot a little bit, but most of the time, you know, if you've played Ka-Zar before, it should be pretty stock standard. So definitely a pretty good list. But overall, that's Ka-Zar. A very popular list, and not one you should forget about, because it always seems to kind of come back into the meta. People like playing it, and it's a list most players will have dabbled with at least for a couple games, right? Like it's a very popular list, so you'll either see it or you've played it before. So all in all, that's what we got. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys learned something. I'll see you in the next one.
Educatedcollins snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you tomorrow, snap. Your skills will be